Hey, more brothers, back again, and this is something I want to talk about, and maybe this could be the wrong channel for it. It might kind of belong on my books channel, which is more about politics and less about male-female interaction in the manosphere. But for the time being, it'll have to land here. I was talking to Mr. Z this morning and his group this morning about what we call BreadTube lefties, because they're lefties, but not quite. I'm not quite understanding what their whole deal is. They use a lot of cis-het and intersectional feminist language, sort of, and they claim that they're lefties and they kind of quote lefty people, but it's not quite connecting. It's like a lot of word salad and metaphors all connected to some sort of end that I don't quite understand what the end is. And I'm good with lefties because for a while I was a lefty. I was a Pacifica lefty, which was at the time radical lefty. Did they have intersectional feminism? Sort of. I don't think intersectional feminism really took hold in the early 90s when I first joined KPFK. It was fringe. So bell hooks and Audre Lorde and a few others were still fringe, even on the lefty channel. KPFK, even though it was a very heavy lefty, socialist, peace-loving channel, the feminists were very, very fringe on KPFK. In fact, even though they were feminists, they would never identify wholly as feminists. They wouldn't just wear it as a badge. It would be integrated into part of whatever they do. So were girls and women important? Sure, they'd mention that. Were they part of the collective for equality for women, but for everybody? Sure, which is why I agreed with them. It wasn't about equality for one group or one group over that group or one peoples over that peoples. It was this working, what I called a working equality for everybody. So the Noam Chomsky's, back then the David Parente's on the black side. God, I'm trying to remember all the names, man. It's been so long since I've been a lefty. And it was just a whole bunch of black guys that you probably wouldn't even know the names of that were lefties back then. Did they have a communist hour? Yeah, they did. Did they have a Marxist hour? Yeah, they did. They also had Buddhism. They also Catholicism. They also had Kabbalahism, which is Jewish mysticism. That's where I learned to appreciate Chris Hedges. That's where I learned to balance communism with capitalism, because were they completely anti-capitalist? No. When capitalism reformed, they didn't want it done away with. Did they want Marxism? They did. But they didn't want the oppressive communism that was going on in the Soviet Union and even in communist China. I would say they were the middle of the road socialists. Were they anti-extractive capitalism? Yeah, they were. They went on NAFTA. They went in on the Swiss codes that used to go on in Europe. They were against the Republican Party and family values, but they're also against the Democratic Party when the Clintons came in. I learned more dirt about the Clintons when they came in than anything else. They were anti-drug, especially pharmaceutical drug, especially the harmful stuff. Were they pro-rights as far as being able to smoke and do and drink and what you wanted within limits, within agreements? They were also pro-environment. They were vegans. They weren't anti-meat, but they were pro a healthy, sustainable lifestyle on the planet. And some things I didn't agree with. There was also a Malthusian bent in the Pacifica left, where they wanted to reduce the number of people on the planet to make it sustainable, which I didn't necessarily agree with. Were they mostly abortion? Yes, they were. But have a balance of a blend of pro-life, where if you didn't put the mother and the family under stress, there would be no need for abortion, where every child could be born and be valued within its own right. So there's a lot of things that are on the left that attracted me. That's some of the tenets I still like, I still hold. So that's how come when I hear the people like the BreadTubers and their left, and I hear their brand of what they call leftism, whatever that is, and their garbled sense of intersectionalism, and it is garbled because I had to learn intersectionalism from the ground up from my learned professors that actually had to teach this stuff. So that's where I learned my intersectionalism, from the source, from the people that taught it, and referred me back to what it was and what their critiques of it was. So with me, it was Dr. Curry, Dr. Johnson, Dr. Neal, Green Gorilla, and a bunch of others that actually sent me back to the original books and for me to actually do a critique of what we call intersectional black feminism. And I read books of my own to do a critique of feminism itself. Like Dr. Green Gorilla asked me to go all the way back to the source of the actual unter of feminism, which is from Locke. Locke had the first mention of what we would call modern feminism today. Just saying that mothers had the right to their children, which was heresy back in the mid 17th century when he mentioned it. It was heresy. So before I go on too much longer about the left, or the history of the left, or what I think the left is, I just want to talk about the BreadTubers, man. Number one, I had never even heard of them, but evidently they were an industry unto themselves. And when FD Signifier, shout out to him for introducing us to a whole new sector of YouTube that we never knew existed, and probably where my opposition has been coming from that I never knew where it was coming from. Because I'm actually going to delve into the BreadTubers, because a lot of what we go up against, especially with this intersectional feminism stuff, does lie in the BreadTubers, because they're the ones that are actually so steeped in it and so learned in it. Basically, they're inside their whole own bubble, inside their own universe, probably in a condensed form. And their rhetoric goes nowhere. That's my first encountering of BreadTubers, like FD Signifier. My whole thing with him talking and trying to figure out, okay, where is he going with this? And when I actually delved into other BreadTubers, they talk about subject, and I always ask, where are they going with this? Like there's no destination. All the lefties, like a Chomsky, like a Hedges, even like the economists like Rasmus and Wolf, were very lefty economists, extremely lefty economists, been around a long time. They work writing for The Nation and Z Magazine and stuff like that. They're very logical, very relatively easy to understand economists, lefties, without all the technical mumbo jumbo that people use. Very left leaning. That's like I use them a lot, because a lot of stuff that the so-called right does, we can call them right, or the mainstream economists and stuff use. I listen to that also. I've read it quite a bit. They actually decipher that stuff because they give you the stuff that's not being said, because they get information just like I do, but they say stuff that's not being said. That's what I use the left and the right for. And normally I would use the left and the right. I use the left to actually plug in holes that the right leaves and vice versa. But BreadTubers, there's no holes because there's no meaning. And what I've come to believe about BreadTubers, even in my short perusal of them, I can only take them in small doses, like 15 minutes, is there is no there. It's entertainment. A lot of what goes on YouTube it's entertainment. And BreadTube, from my brief perusal of it, it's entertainment for lost lefties. That's what I'm starting calling BreadTube. Entertainment for lost lefties. You don't have anything to do with your degree. You're not really involved in that many movements. So there's nothing for you to do. And you want to go back to your old college days with the secret decoder ring. You have to know the exact wording to understand and critique the real world. So they're really in Guy Jesus' cave, actually looking at the shadows and trying to decipher the movements oh, this shadow moved left or right or bent over, and it kind of flickered a bit. So we're trying to determine what that actually means. So we have these, we have to go back to our code and figure out, okay, what can we use to actually describe this movement? That's why when FD signifier, I talked about that the first time was actually talked about, he mentioned Gramsci and what Gramsci stood for. So I'm perusing Gramsci and I'm reading over his stuff. I said, okay, let me find out about this guy's history. He was actually thrown in prison by his fellow socialist, which was Il Duce, because Il Duce adopted fascism instead of liberal socialism. And Gramsci didn't agree with it, so guess what? He got tossed, just like everybody got tossed into prison. And my first thing about any author that I read is understanding who he is and what his worldview is. And I've determined, since Gramsci was basically an anti-fascist, which is why he got hauled to the Hoosgow, especially in the 20s. Because fascism in the 20s was very nascent. It was just starting out. And fascism in the 20s was basically a rejection of liberal capitalism, which had failed Italy and Germany. And what they wanted to do is turn back to a more Bismarckian, there's a word for you, more Bismarckian authoritarian model, which is really what fascism is actually built on. It's really not socialist, or socialist in the vein that the West or the Europeans think of socialism, or the West thinks of socialism. It's not even, it's somewhere between Russian communism, Chinese communism, and the liberal democratic socialism that's blended in with capitalism. It's a different kind of authoritarian. In fact, Il Duce wanted to go back to that blended authoritarian feudalism that Germany and Bismarck had evolved out of. More like what Napoleon gave. That kind of authoritarianism that actually worked, actually bonded people together, which actually was the built up what we call Central Europe, which Italy was a part of, and a more efficient form of socialism and capitalism. Socialism, capitalism actually is integrated everywhere in the world. When you mix authoritarianism in there with it, it's actually more efficient. What did say about Il Duce? He made the trains run on time. It's a more efficient form. But you can't understand Gramsci if you can't understand Italian fascism. You can't understand Italian fascism until you understand Bismarck. Got to go back to Bismarck. Bismarck was actually introduced really the first iteration of socialism anyway, because he hated socialists. So he adopted their movement and implemented their means, because he saw that people wanted it. He implemented their programs his way. Social Security was actually implemented first by Bismarck. First one that did it. And he mixed it with capitalism. But that's an aside. We're going on what BreadTube is. Well, I'm saying that kind of analysis, so far that I've seen, is missing from BreadTube. BreadTube is about making jokes out of the real world, like little kids. It's entertainment. It's more, I said BreadTube was more akin to a Dave Chappelle stand-up. The stand-up when he's mixing in left rhetoric and mixing in terms and putting things in like what he did to Closer. That was more like BreadTube comedy, which is probably why it sold. That's probably why he knew it would sell. Got a lot of lost academics, so-called academics, that have nothing to do with their ideas. They're probably working in corporate someplace, and they're banging their head against the wall because nothing of what they learned is applied, at least seemingly, which is why I know you can go down this BreadTube hole. So I'm going to leave it at that, in my opinion. Maybe I'm going to try to delve into it more and pick them off one at a time about who they are and what they're about. I'm starting with, I don't even know if they're BreadTube or not. I know they're lefties. We've already talked about FD Signifier. I don't need to talk about him. I don't think For Harriet is BreadTube. I think they're intersectional feminists, whatever that means. You know, I mean, I hear so many meanings about it and so many things attached to it that intersectional feminism has pretty much lost most of what it means, or its unctuous, or its reason for being. But that be it as it may. But I'm going to start with some of the lefties that Mr. Z actually talks about. And we're going to break them down and try to figure out what is their oomph there. Why are they here? What do they want? And we'll delve into BreadTube, which is a whole bizarro world in itself. Because when I entered BreadTube, it's like it's a bizarro world. Like I'm a lefty, I'm an old-fashioned progressive lefty, Pacifica lefty that gave up the ghost. And you know, once I figured out Bill Clinton wasn't who he said he was, I figured out the right and the left weren't as far apart as they think. And as my teacher once told me, the right and the left only disagree on things that don't matter. The things that matter, they agree with. Things that matter, they agree with. Even down to the Ukraine war. Most of what I saw on the left at the time went right along with the rest of America's push. Even though the Russians are actually still left-leaning. And the Chinese are still left-leaning. When it came down to the Ukraine war, instead of getting the detailed analysis from left and right, you got pretty much talking points. Now they're starting to disintegrate. They're changing their tune, they're changing their mind. But helpful criticism. The only people on the left that I actually found that actually were worth a damn were actually the RT folks. And RT gave them enough room to actually tell the truth. They didn't try to propagandize them, which they probably could have. They're paying them. But they actually took lefties that had good sense and had enough fortitude left to actually do something with it, with their leftism, that would actually make a difference, that impacts the world. Anyhow, let me go ahead and end this and try to get this up. I know this is not going to make any sense because it doesn't, you know, me listening to it, it doesn't make sense to me. Okay, so, but that is my observation or my opinion on BreadTube. With that, I'm going to jump off here. This is BGS out, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.